So now we're going to talk about workplace stress. We don't have tigers in the workplace, right? But we do have other forms of stress. The first form of stress, or cause of stress, could be something that's not a tiger, but something that's big, and that leads me to perceive it as a threat, and therefore I go into the panic mode, and the entire stress response gets triggered, right? A thought like, oh, I might lose my job, or this thing is due by tomorrow, or oh my god, this is going to create a complete mess, or oh my god, I'm going to get laid off, or my company is going to get taken over, or I don't know where I stand, or it could be an ego threat, like oh my god, people are going to laugh at me. So there's something big that's going on in your life, and it triggers the stress response. Well, we sort of know, we know ways of dealing with it, right? So there are different ways. One is to put that threat in perspective, to really see, is it that big enough? Is it that scary enough? Work with it, cognitive reframing, right? Recognize it. And that's where the space between the, so I told you adrenaline gets sort of pretty much released right away, but cortisol, it's a two-step process. So if you're mindful enough, you're aware, we can catch it in the bud, we can actually prevent a lot of damage that happens. So we can prevent, we can step in before the stress attacks. If it does, we can also find ways to calm ourselves, to believe that the threat doesn't really work. But we have to work at eliminating the cause, not just the response, because if it's not a cause that we can run away from. So if it is a deadline that's really bothering us, we could just do it, right? So we could decide to get focused and finish it. So that's the kind of stress that, like, you can run away from it, in the sense you eliminate the cause. You work so that the cause is no longer there. That's one approach. It is a great approach, and stress can actually help you in such a case to work more so that you eliminate the cause. If the cause is something like I told you, an imaginary thought that is not going to come true or false, and it just keeps occurring, you have to work on your mind. You have to work on not, you can't eliminate that, but you have to reappraise that. You have to come to a place where you don't see that as a threat anymore. That's really the only way you can manage that stress. But now I'm going to focus on another kind of workplace stress that happens to all of us, and this is specific because in this case there's no one big thing that scares us. It's just lots of tiny demands on our time, and this can stress us as well. Sounds familiar? Yeah? Okay. So there's actually Edward Hallowell has coined a term for this kind of stress that's induced by several small demands on our attention. And the term that he's coined for it is attention deficit trait. So it's not an attribute of a person, but it's something that's triggered by the environment, and it can happen to anyone. So I'm going to draw a very rough sketch of the brain, where I'm going to focus on two parts. Okay, so this, we're going to call it our primitive brain. Now this is the one that we share with our ancestors, reptiles, and this is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes, as well as the prefrontal lobes. Edward Hallowell calls it the executive functioning, and he rightly calls it that because this is the part of the brain that's most evolved, that we human beings have, and perhaps chimpanzees have to some extent. But this is the part that we use the most as managers, as executives, right? This is the part, the prefrontal lobes and the frontal lobes. This is the part that we use for decision making, for calculations, for prioritizing, for logic, for all the stuff that we value about ourselves, for the kind of work that we do. Now this prefrontal cortex, right? It's it's like a supercomputer. It's very capable and it's very efficient, but it's not a very good parallel processor. So it's more of a serial processor, less of a parallel processor. Now when we do this in classes, people ask, yeah, but aren't there individual variations in this? Aren't women supposed to be better at parallel processing than men? All of that is true. Yes, there are individual variations. Yes, women are better than men, but let's say everyone has a threshold of processing things in parallel, right? So for me personally, I know that the threshold is quite low. Give me more than 2 important tasks at the same time and I start getting edgy and pretty. But I know people who can do 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, maybe you can do 7. But at some point, you will reach your threshold. And that's the point I'm making. For each of us, our prefrontal cortex has a threshold. Our threshold might be unique to us. So my threshold might be different from your threshold. But we have a threshold. We do not have infinite capacity to process things in parallel. Now, we need to know our own threshold, because what happens? What happens when we hit our threshold? So these are demands on attention and demands for processing that the environment places on our prefrontal cortex, right, on the executive function. Now, when we hit our threshold, this one gives up. It gives up and says, I can't handle this. Too many things in parallel. It sends a panic signal to the primitive brain. Panic. I can't handle this. Now, the way the hierarchy of the brain is structured is that usually it's the primitive brain which is it's higher in the hierarchy, and it's sort of sending like these all is well umbrella signals, right, to the prefrontal cortex. Everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. And as long as this one, the limbic brain, the primitive brain is fine, satiated, comfortable, the prefrontal cortex is the neocortex as well. So the frontal lobes have all the space they need and the permission they need to function amazingly. When a threat is noticed, so go back to the tiger example, when the threat was noticed, then the primitive brain actually comes into the rider's seat, and the functioning of the prefrontal cortex is partially suppressed. Only some parts of it are functioning, and it's not functioning at full capacity. So we talked about that earlier, right? So focus, not nuanced thinking, only certain kinds of thinking, all of that. And the primitive brain, fight or flight, the very animal instincts, I just need to run and get out of here, that's a thought that the primitive brain will fuel. That's in the riding seat, and that helps you escape from that perceived threat. So once there's a threat, this one comes into the riding seat. In the tiger example, that threat signal came from outside the tiger. In this case, the threat signal is internally generated. So the threat signal is generated from my own prefrontal cortex, my own frontal lobes, which cannot handle all the parallel demands and attention, and it says, panic, and the control goes here. Now this kind of stress is, or you could call it ADT, is very interesting in 2 ways. One, the first reason why it's interesting is that the brain gets sort of caught up into this catch-22, neurological catch-22 situation, because the reason we got stressed, the reason we got into this muddle was because we had several demands on our prefrontal cortex, right? And let's say these could be demands on any typical work day. Maybe they would be like, I was trying to work on some calculations in an Excel sheet, I had an email request, or they can be just demands for attention, right? I had an email request, and to send something, I was trying to do that in parallel. A colleague steps in and says, do this. I have another window open, and I'm also thinking about a presentation I have to make later in the day. I'm thinking about organizing something. Tons of that, right? All these small things. But they all require my prefrontal cortex. Now, once this is in the riding seat, what is the kind of action that I can do? I'm equipped to run away. I'm equipped to do very primitive action. I cannot solve that problem. I cannot structure that presentation. I cannot reply to that email. I cannot process and prioritize, because my primitive brain cannot do the kind of work that the prefrontal cortex has to do. But the primitive brain is in the riding seat. So this one says, panic noted, can't solve the problem. This one, panic, panic. Panic, 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 panic. And that's the neurological catch-22 situation. Now, ADT, or this kind of stress, is also unique in the sense, one of the characteristics, how do you recognize if you have ADT? One of the characteristics that is unique to this kind of stress is a sense of low panic and guilt. Panic you can understand. Why the sense of guilt? Well, the sense of guilt because I'm not able to put my finger on the cause of the stress. If it's a fear that I might lose my job, or if it's a fear that I have this upcoming deadline that I have to prepare for, I know the cause of my stress. In this case, I don't know. And I feel guilty because I'm supposed to be able to do all these things. I'm supposed to be handled so much, and it gets worsened by the sort of, implicit norms that we seem to have in the workplace these days in corporate life, that we should be able to handle a lot of stuff at the same time. There seems to be this implicit norm, and somehow this norm has got formed by people who didn't know enough about the brain, because nature didn't intend us to. Nature didn't intend us to, our prefrontal cortex to, parallelly process things the way we've designed iPhones to. We didn't design our brains. Nature designed it for us, and she designed it for us to handle a limited number of things. But we're trying to do a lot of things in parallel, and we don't realize that even though we are completely capable of doing each of these tasks, none of them is beyond our ability or capability. We just aren't designed to do them all at the same time. So when we don't realize that, we feel guilty because we're not doing stuff that we're supposed to be able to do. We feel guilty and incompetent and irritable and panicked. Okay, so that's a variation of the workplace stress that can occur actually even when there isn't a big threat looming out there.